Happy Easter, except it's not Easter yet, because we're doing Second Gethsemane this week because Kilts is, of course, now in Holy Week, and we have some more hard stuff to meditate on. I mean, I'm not sure whether this one's not going to be a harder Gethsemane than last week, because then we were thinking about the way Christ carries our sins. But now we wanted to take on that big one that nobody talks about and that we really need as Christians to be able to think about. And there are various ways of saying it. I'm even hesitating to name the topic because I think we don't know as Americans or Australians as a culture how to deal with the fact that not everybody in Jesus's immediate circle recognized him as the one that could carry their sins. And over the centuries, that difference of opinion on whether or not he is our Lord and Savior has persisted up to the present day, that there are some of us, is it one tradition within this tradition? Dare we say, is there such a thing as a Judeo-Christian tradition? When it all goes down to that moment under the cross when some say yes and some say no. And we don't know how to talk about what that means. So we figured we'd try, because, yeah, we go out in the ark into the really deep waters that nobody else goes, and we find krakens and dragons and monsters and leviathans. So stick with us on the Mosaic Ark. Well, now I made her laugh because I talked about monsters.
Seriously.
We're doing Second Gethsemane tonight, and we can't be laughing about this. This is serious stuff, you know.
It is,
because Christians. I mean, it's a bad thing if Christians are in sin because we recognize Christ as our Savior. Wait, okay, my mind just broke.
I should really stop laughing. It's all very
It's
horrible.
gallows humor. It's definitely gallows humor. This is see, we didn't laugh last week because we recognize the gravity of the sin, but now it's like, what do? We're oh no.
Yes. It's a tricky one. It's a very difficult conversation to have because no one wants to have it. No one wants to have this conversation for so many different reasons also.
Yeah.
And of course, because we, the Copts, are in the middle of Holy Week at the moment, we're meditating on all of this at the moment. Looking forward to the liturgy of prayer for the conversion of the Jews that we do every Easter after our Lenten fast, and also the night of the Apocalypse, and meditating on what it means to be Israel in expectation of the New Jerusalem. So there's a lot of things that are bubbling up for all of us right now. we we have a lot of really heavy things to meditate on. Yeah, that's how I will start this.
Well, but I think that's for a lot of people that will be unfamiliar, because I mean, within post-Vatican II Catholicism, I don't think we pray that way anymore. It's like,
oh, really?
Well, I mean, certainly, I don't know what you just described as those meditations. I don't think they had a place in pre-Vatican II liturgies, but I know, one of the things is taking out the line of, the perfidious Jews, which it's interesting that phrase of itself can seem so evil to say, because it means faithless, which, since by definition Jews do not have faith in Jesus as the Christ, it's a kind of descriptive term. But yes. But I do know one of my friends, one of my good friends in academia, had been, well, she's Jewish in her family history, and she first converted to Orthodoxy, but there were prayers in there both against the faithlessness of the Jews towards Christ, towards Jesus as the Christ. And there were prayers about that in the liturgy, and she just said, I couldn't do that. So now she's Anglo-Catholic in her worship. It's something that's been incredibly uncomfortable obviously it has been incredibly uncomfortable in the West for those Christians that look to what happened in the Holocaust as defining of modernity. And to say, how responsible were we, and who's the we in that, and to what degree, is there a responsibility on Christians for, the Holocaust, and then, well, apparently the Holocaust is absolutely unique. So
yes.
I've been called on this, tripped over it a few times, and say, well, if we put it in the context of the other horrors of the 20th century, Christians also have difficulty talking about World War I, because you had armies of Christians fighting against each other, and that we just end up in this inability to speak.
Yes. You bring to mind quite a few things. So, perhaps we don't find it as difficult to have this conversation because our people had nothing to do with World War II. I say our people, being Coptics. Of course, let me rephrase that. We didn't have nothing to do with World War II. Our experience of World War II was very different. The involvement of a lot of the Coptic people in that conflict began as a rejection of the fascist powers wanting to invade Ethiopia. So we have this kind of memory of a rejection of fascism, but also none of the heightened emotion around the kind of fascism that was going on in Germany, because the Jews in the Coptic world have had a very different experience than the Jews that have been in exile in Europe. So having a liturgy which is reflecting on the relationships between Jews and Christians in the Coptic world, we don't immediately recall the recent this recent World War conflict as influencing that conversation, that liturgical conversation.
Right.
For us, our talking about the relationships between Christians and Jews is rooted in the in the Passion, in Holy Week, in the events that revolve around Gethsemane, the arrest of Christ, his trial and his crucifixion, and what happened afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So that probably is an important thing for people to realize, that we don't speak of Jews and Christians and the conflict there and recall the European situation. We're thinking in a more ancient way, much more historical. Yeah.
This is going to be startling, I think, for a lot of people, because, I mean, with the Western Anglo-European tradition, and certainly I'm, familiar from this in my own academic specialty, because much of this, well, the conflict, let me say, I've got this book in my lap, which is by my departmental colleague at the University of Chicago, David Nirenberg, called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And it basically is all of it, right? To think about Judaism in the Western tradition is, so his premise, and David's a very subtle thinker, and so it's easy, you don't want to go into caricature on anything, because he's trying very hard to make sure that all of these things have their proper nuance. And his premise is that there is an anti-Judaic strain in the Western tradition throughout, right? That it's sort of it's a consistent and present element to the way in which the West has defined itself, which is not the same thing as saying the Western tradition is anti-Judaic. And I do think he tries very hard to not say that, but it's a little, there is this anti-Judaic strain. Does that make the entire tradition anti-Judaic? Some would maybe say yes. I'm not entirely sure. But that, just to give you a sense of the scope, that he starts not, in fact, with Christianity, but with Egypt. Mm-hmm. I mean, all the way back, right? Saying that there was, yes, from Exodus, and he also gives an example of, that there's, ancient descriptions against Judaism even before the New Testament, and particularly a debate in about Jews in Elephantine, which is
Elephantine,
yeah. So that I'm not. So I remember when David was writing this and it was coming out, and he was saying, some people had told him you don't want to write that, and these are sometimes Jews. So I recognize that some of the problem of the long tradition is also there's debates. I mean, just as there's debates within Christianity about how to think about Judaism, there's debates within Judaism about how to think about its relationship to Christianity. And not all of the scholars in the trying to understand this aspect of the Western tradition agree with the way David set this up. But he's saying that there is this long duration, and it begins he starts it in Egypt, and then of course there's early Christianity with Paul in the New Testament, the early church. John Chrysostom figures strongly in that chapter. Chapter on Jewish enmity in Islam, a chapter on Jews and their place in medieval Europe. That was called Jews and Power in Medieval Europe. Chapter on the Inquisition in Spain, on the Reformation, on Shakespeare. Then we jump, and then Israel, the foundation of Christian politics in the early modern period, Enlightenment revolts against Judaism, the revolutionary perfection of the world, 1789, to now, I guess, philosophical struggles with Judaism from Kant to Heine, modernity thinks with Judaism. And a final epilogue on several Jewish intellectuals, including Hannah Arendt, Eric Auerbach, and a couple others. And I know Eric Auerbach from it's like you can't even speak eventually without realizing yes, how much of the tradition has been arguing with, and I think that David's strong point is arguing with an image of Judaism that may or may not in fact be Judaism, right? So that there's the sort of particularly in the Middle Ages, what one scholar has called the hermeneutical Jew, the Jew that you use to talk about what Christianity is, but that does not in fact exist as a real person or as a real tradition. It's just a sort of shadow projection. So that's to a little bit of extent of some of what I know we're tangled up in and being able to talk about it. And then of course there's the more recent, you were alluding to, the more recent, post Second World War tangle that the United States finds itself in politically and therefore culturally. And then Catholicism's attitude that got tangled up with, we can't even speak. I'm just going to stutter through most of this. My usual fluency being trapped in the exactly what I not even what, well, so some of it's exactly what we were talking about. Some of it as a topic, right? Problems. Some of it is, why is it so hard to talk about?
Well, I don't approach this from a scholarly perspective. I just kind of, I'm vibing my way through this problem. But it's difficult to talk about, I think, because a lot of people have lost the connection between veneration of the Virgin Mary and the expression of the Christian faith. And because in Coptic worship, we are constantly referring to Mary, to the Virgin, in the context of Israelite identity, we're not ever minimizing it, we're maximizing it constantly. She's a lot of people talk about whitewashing history, whitewashing cultures, and that kind of thing. Especially in Egypt, this profound shift between seeing the Hebrews as sojourners in Egypt to being the liberators of the Egyptian people from their pre-Christian bondage. The Egyptian Coptic world received the Holy Family, received the Virgin Mary and Joseph and Christ when he was an infant. This has profoundly impacted the Coptic thinking around Israel, its relationship to the Israelites, and that is because of the Virgin. So this is the place I'm going to start, because from the perspective of the Protestant world that don't even have a basic understanding of why Catholics are venerating Mary in the first place, it's really, really hard to see why we are so endlessly obsessed with the Virgin and her place in the story of Christ. And it's because of this enormous shift in Africa's relationship to Israel and the Israelites that are in Africa, and what it brought Christ into the Nile civil refuge from Herod. So the first thing I have to emphasize is that, especially this week, we are reflecting on how Mary is, for us, foundational to the existence of Israel, which would be very strange for Protestants to think about, because you say Israel, you hear that and you think the state. In a liturgical context, this does not mean a political state. It, for us, is a spiritual kingdom. It's Christ's spiritual kingdom. So that's probably the first place that I need to start. The the beginning of this conversation has to start with the Virgin. If we don't have her, we cannot have a very clear discussion on anything, because it gets very, very heated very quickly, and also we don't have a clarity of the terms that we're using. So yeah, hopefully that places the first brick on the road of being able to get into it a little bit more.
Well, I think it's actually the middle of the road.
Okay. And I start in the middle.
No, but I think you're saying that's because that is the answer. And it's one that we've been trying to explain to people over the year, and with more and less success depending on who catches which bits of it. So maybe if we back up a bit and okay, unpack a bit more specifically why this term Judeo-Christian is so fraught right now, and sort of if you can tell us a bit more about, I mean, the history of, I mean, Ethiopia and its understanding of itself as a country, because you were just saying, so we need Mary in Egypt to understand that Israel is not a political entity, but that's going to be really hard for a lot of people already. Yes. Because yes, you know, sort of arguing about whether or not Israel is properly a political entity in the United States is a. I have this colleague at the University of Chicago. I have every. It's like if you have any University of Chicago professor on anything that you're doing, buckle up, right? Because no, I just thought, you know, I gotta get in trouble, and I don't even know why, right? I'm like, maybe you should start with the fact that I teach at the University of Chicago, because just to give you an idea how difficult it is to be at the University of Chicago, what it's been like to survive at the University of Chicago, surrounded by, let's say, David Nierenberg to start with, right, who writes difficult books about anti-Judaism, but also, for example, one of my absolute most favorite senior colleagues, may he rest in peace, Peter Novick, who I knew. This guy's got to take you on a little tour here. I do have slides that will help us out of this at the moment, but I need you to understand my credentials just a sec, because I am doing this as a scholar, not just vibing, but kind of vibing on other people's scholarship too. So Peter Novick was very, very famous by the time I arrived at the University of Chicago. I arrived in 1994, because in 1989 he'd come out with a massive, massive book called That Noble Dream, the objectivity question, the American historical profession, in which he showed how difficult it was for historians not to take sides as they were telling their stories of particularly like Civil War history in the United States. So, and this was, you know, he had receptions at the American Historical Association. He told me when I met him, because I was like, oh, I've read your book and it's really amazing. I was fangirling a lot because his office was across the hall from me, which was a peril because he smoked like a chimney. It's like you think of Peter, you think of cigarette and brilliance, right? He's smoking, and I said, you know, I read this book and I was really fascinated by it, because I was trying to understand at the time what medieval Christians were saying the historical sense of scripture meant. And this is topical to some of the images we have to show people. The historical sense of scripture meant when it was talking about Christ and Mary in the Song of Solomon. Right. So we have this love song, Christ and Mary, and somehow in the Song of Songs, in the Song of Solomon, they saw this history, this story, right? And so I'm reading Peter because, one, it's brilliant, and two, I'm trying to figure out where in my world my problems of making sense of these tangled layers of reality can fit. And I said, well, you know, so he'd written that book on That Noble Dream. Well, I did not realize this, but he was at that time in 1994 in the middle of writing his second major book of his career, which was The Holocaust in American Life, which when that came out, I remember him talking about it because he got a lot of pushback from fellow Jews, among other things. Most of the time, Christians just stand back and go, I don't know what to say. Because he was trying to understand how the Holocaust had gained the prominence that it had in American life, particularly from the 1970s. And it's very interesting in his book because he shows that immediately after the Second World War, it was not talked about by Americans, by Jews in America, or by Americans generally. The focus was on the foundation of Israel, the heroism of creating the new state, and not on the details or even the very little discussion he found, which was interesting, but he knew that because he grew up in it, until around 1970. That's one. But at the same time, because you have Peter writing this book on the Holocaust in American life, another of my colleagues was Rashid Khalidi, who has not been, he left and went to Columbia some years ago. But you may, if you are politically inclined at all, know that he was good friends with, Barack Obama. And Rashid and Barack were good friends. I was, in the department with Rashid for several years. And Rashid was the most famous and prominent spokesperson on the behalf of the Palestinians. Oh dear. This is two people. I've now named three people in my department. Can I keep going? Right. I had oh yes, John Mearsheimer, who is not in my department, but is at the University of Chicago, is right now famous for his 2015 lectures on how the United States is misbehaving itself in the Ukraine. He and Steve Walt back in 2006, I think, I forgot the date exactly, wrote a book about the Israel lobby and its influence on American politics. So those of you watching who may be a little stunned by why I have such thick skin about talking about such difficult things, well, guess I swim with the piranhas on a daily basis. You recognize I've named people on 4 different sides of the single most explosive topic in modern political discussion, and they were all at the University of Chicago. We haven't even started with the list of all the other people that are at the University of Chicago. So I've thought about it a little bit, and and also obviously also thought about it in the context of what does the Middle Ages have to do with modernity, because it's an ongoing difficulty in all of these conversations to say the Middle Ages helps make sense of, challenges our modern dark ages, right? Because we're in them. I mean, Vox was talking today about how, we're going to end up in the dark ages because all the digital information is being zapped, right? As in the burning of the library at Alexandria by Caesar, if that happened under Cleopatra, who knows? That we're in difficult times, and we're in very, very difficult conversations. And it has been my contention all along that we need to learn to practice talking about these things without letting our emotions create the arguments for us, because they are very, very difficult for people to be dispassionate about. But going back to Peter Novick, he recognized that from the beginning, that one, history is always going to be principally a moral endeavor as a discipline, as a scholarly discipline, but also as a philosophical and intellectual discipline, which hopefully are scholarly too. And so this is really necessary, right? We have to learn to talk about these things without bringing the heat of our own identities into our formal discussions. And I do think I've said this in the past. I said it when Milo was getting deplatformed back in 2017. If we don't practice this in this kind of setting, right, our formal live stream or on campus setting, people just end up screaming at each other in the streets. And now that you and I have been talking so much about the Girardian doubling and twinning and the mimetic rivalries, I think I have understanding of the mechanism for it. But okay, so prelude why we really thought we needed to talk about this today, and also why, if I seem hardened in some ways, like ridiculously able to talk about stuff that other people have declared off limits, it's kind of because I'm surrounded by scholars who make that their responsibility. I mean, Rashid to stand up for the Palestinians, John Mearsheimer to say, what relationship should Israel have to our political endeavor? Peter talking about the difficulties of thinking about the Holocaust and whether or not it should be the defining characteristic of modern American Jewish identity, as it seems to have become. David defining the Western traditions. Class, are there questions? I'm going to stop and read the chat for the moment. We got
just a few.
The chat is likewise tongue-tied, says Paper Eating Bear. Yes. Casey, being friends with Christ and his mother does not make one friends in the world. Well, yeah, we're gonna have to talk about that. Casey, American Civil War. I think you meant the War of Northern Aggression. Yes. And Casey, rhetoric is manipulative, but it works. Well, yes, right. And indeed, throughout all of this, Kilts and I are obviously using rhetoric to kind of hope to persuade everyone to sit and listen rather than end up screaming at us first. Please. We're sweet. Look at us. We're sweet. Oh, she's young. I'm old. But, you know, we are trying to be ladies about this and practice the difficult, right? So that's my... You have the Coptic liturgical context. I have the snake pit of
the piranha
of the
piranha
University
tank.
of Chicago intellectual life. Anyway.
Well, I mean, I was used to having these... Look, I've been very, very blessed because I got used to having these kinds of conversations with Africans who have these kinds of conversations. It's very strange that Westerners are in many ways bragging that they're the champions of free speech or champions of rigorous intellectual debates, etc. And yet I've had very, very, very interesting chats in the middle of Africa that I would never be able to have had here in Australia, just because the sensitivity that you've just described is so heightened, and that we've sunk into a bit of a cultural depression where people mistake a heated conversation with the personal attack. I don't know. There's not a joviality about this topic here that exists where I used to live, and with the people that first brought me into Orthodoxy. So we have had a completely different exposure. I have not had the piranha environment that you've had to deal with academically. I will say the piranhas tend to be on the outside, because those of us in the tank are practiced at, I don't know, jousting. I'm not sure, right? It's like the piranha. It's like there's a piranha level of the intensity of our intellectual engagement at Chicago. But, the opposite side, I think it sounds more like what you're experiencing in Africa. You know that it's okay because it's what you do, right? You know that you have these difficult conversations and people stare at you and say, I disagree with you. And you stare back and say, yeah, I disagree with you. Yeah. Which is fine. So I'm trying to figure out where to begin talking about this, because for a large population of people, the word Judeo-Christian doesn't exist. This term that is used in the West to describe the relationship between Judaism and Christianity and the effect on the culture, this term is not used in Africa. Judeo-Christianity in the cultures where the origins of a lot of the stories are from, the biblical stories, they don't use this term. They have a very, very different way of describing the relationship between people that are following either faith. So maybe to give some context to begin, I should probably say that the first sort of difficult baptism of fire into this subject that I had was with a Black Jew who came from a family that had historically practiced the same Judaism as the Falasha from Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, which they call Haymanot. And his family had later converted to Islam for whatever reason, to assimilate politically or because they actually had a legitimate religious conversion, I'm not sure. But this gentleman had absolutely no hang-ups about talking about his family history whatsoever. He was really, he was laughing with me and we were chatting, and there were a few other like similarities between the two of us, this being one of them, that we have had this the memory of distant relatives that are in a different religious persuasion to us. And he was also a great lover of Greek culture, so we bonded over this shared love of Greece and all things Hellenic. But he was explaining to me that he and his family had this experience, that this is not rare, that it is in fact quite common in that part of the world to find families which are aware of their Hebraic roots and yet have become Islamified. Mm. And so they have a very different relationship to conversion than maybe some people do in different parts of Europe. But because of this kind of conversion experience, they also had a very interesting take on the relationship between Christians and Jews and Hebrews that were in different faiths. For them, they could make a very clear storyline that connected them to the Israelite story, regardless of the faith that they're currently practicing now. And I found that really striking. I found it really really beautiful also that there was not this need to deny heritage, where that kind of opened up the conversation to how did you guys actually get here in the first place. So when this man in particular and the other people that I was talking to were explaining the kind of cultural cartography and how heavily influenced it was by the African Jewish diaspora, that this is really only documented through oral history, I was very, very shocked. And then I had to, keep digging and keep talking to people and look at, okay, well, hold on a second. They're only making religious distinctions here. They're not making racial distinctions.
Right, which is a big one for a lot of so Americans and Europeans around Judaism.
Yes.
Some of which my colleague David has written about, because he's written a lot about what happens in the 15th century and the arguments that develop in Spain over blood, the purity of the blood, limpieza de sangre. And yes, and so, but what you're saying is that kind of argument doesn't develop in Africa?
In the particular area that I was in, they did not have this issue with what I like to call racial fractions. It was never an issue of blood purity. It was an issue of conversion and practice of true faith. The people there were more concerned with that expression of religion than they were their ethnic heritage. The reason why it was so strange for me in the beginning was because these were Muslims. So it's not like having a discussion about the conversos in Portugal or Spain, where there's been a bit of an argument over a forced conversion and whether or not we're still Jews in blood, but we have religious, conversion. We're Christians, but we're still Jews. And no, they were the people I was talking to. They were very unfazed by having Hebrew heritage and yet being Islamic without there being any contradiction whatsoever. And so, yeah, it was a different environment. There were no racial fractions. So that sort of set up the beginning for me to start to look at, okay, well, what areas did you come from? Where have you been scattered? up until the point where you've been, living here for several generations, and you now have an Arabized name. Solomon becomes Suleimani, and this kind of integration happens. So I was pointed up north into the Horn of Africa, where there's another enormous population of people which also have the same shared mythological heritage. So this then puts me in the in the problem of Judeo-Christian versus what I would call a Solomonic identity more than a Judeo-Christian one.
Okay, so we have some slides to help us with this, which I haven't been showing yet. Because this is what we're showing as usual, is that everything is way more layered and tangled than the two-word answers that people yell at each other tend to suggest. And those of you in the Milosphere know he had a debate with Destiny last night, and the thing about Christian nationalism, and one of the things that constantly strikes me about that is people don't seem to know what other of those terms mean. Ever. And specifically the what you're talking about, the racial fractions and stuff, they use Christian as if it's a racial term, like we're gonna have this Christian nation, when it's from your and my perspective, obviously, that it's meaningless. It's like, well, but what do you mean? You mean you are people who are all have Christianity, or there's they're politically Christian? I think some of what you want to show us in your discussions of Ethiopia help with this, but there's also just the fundamental misunderstanding of what we say when we say we're a Christian nation. I think in part because, and we're showing now Charlton Heston with his speaking to the cars, right? He's speaking to the cars, and then there's Rembrandt showing the Rembrandt version of showing the tablets, and that we have been talking about ourselves in these terms, right? We're a Christian, we're a Judeo-Christian nation since the mid 20th century, particularly after World War II, and particularly, it's like the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments as a movie is very interesting because it's so reverent in so many ways, but you can feel it coming out of this moment when the political specifically the political conversation is using Judeo-Christian as its marker for what we in the West are, as against those godless communists, right? And it's and I was reading deeply this week in Peter Novick's Holocaust in American Life book, and he has a very interesting footnote to a great article by Mark Silk, who I know. I think I've met him in person. I know him as a great scholar of American Protestantism. And he did this article in the 1980s talking about, one, how Judeo-Christian was falling out of favor. It wasn't really a term that people liked anymore. And I'm like, what? Clearly the 80s are back with us, and not just in the music that they have in Guardians of the Galaxy, right? That the heyday of the term Judeo-Christian is specifically as a political weapon against Soviet atheism, against communism. And so I think people who invoke it now invoke it in the same breath as saying America, right? But in that we want our power back. We want our which we're not going to get back, guys. Just saying, we're in humility time now. And then if you start studying the use of the term, you showed me an interesting article, and I went and looked up one of the things that it suggested.
Oh, the ABC one.
Yeah, this ABC one. And one of the things it does is go to Google Ngrams and find out when exactly Judeo-Christian actually appears as a term. And I think the author of that article is a scholar of Judaism. I wasn't sure.
Yes.
Emeritus Professor and Professor Philip Almond, Emeritus Professor and Professorial Research Fellow in the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. It's written about God and the devil and the afterlife. Okay. But anyway, he went and looked at the Google Ngram and said, look, if you search back, and he did it from 1800, you don't find any use of Judeo-Christian, from 1800 up to around the 1940s, right? And then it goes up in the late 1940s, drops back down, goes way up later. Well, the thing is, if you expand Google Ngram to go all the way back to the beginning of the English archive, you don't get it anywhere there either, right? As a term, it's completely tied to this political usage from the mid-20th century. And Professor Almond, in this ABC article, because he's talking about Australia and whether or not Australia should be using this term, points out,
yes,
there's problems with it on all sides, right? Because it's, in the context of the longer history that David talks about of the anti-Judaism, it's in the context of, this is a curious one. Christians actually, it's philo-Semitic in the sense that you love the Semitic people, but you pray for their conversion from Judaism, which is therefore still anti-Jewish, because you're saying, faith in Christ is necessary. And he concludes with saying, we shouldn't be using this term at all, which fits more with what Mark Silk was saying they were trying to do in the 80s, saying, and this was a good passage that Almond wrote, at the end of the day, or the end of the world for that matter, the term Judeo-Christian is one we might well do to abandon. It conceals the Western history of anti-Judaism. Even when in philo-Semitic mode it appears to extol the virtue of Jewish identity, it is deeply anti-Judaic. Simply put, then, there is no such thing as the Judeo-Christian tradition. It is a modern invention. There always has been a Jewish tradition and a Christian tradition, or more accurately, varieties of Jewish and Christian traditions. I don't know. The plural game is one that my colleagues in the divinity school do a lot in Christianity, or Christianities. But anyway, are we Christianities, or are you and I different? Whatever. The term Judeo-Christian tradition continues the suppression of Jewishness by hiding the essential differences between Judaism and Christianity, one of which is that each denies the validity of the other, which I think is very fair. As Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz puts it, quote, Judaism is Judaism because it rejects Christianity, and Christianity is Christianity because it rejects Judaism. Okay, does that hold in the... Well, no, it's and indeed, this is the kind of thing you just want to say. It's like, really, you guys, they're literally, well, and the problem is it two sides of the same coin, right? And when you start playing the all religions teach the same thing, and aren't they monotheistic, and therefore they really basically have this one minor little disagreement, a trinity, or are they, completely separate traditions, or they, developed in, but anyway, what struck me when you talk about the Coptic tradition and the conversations you've had is that even those lines aren't quite as clearly drawn.
No, and I think this is because in the African world, they are. This is a gross generalization, but I have to do it for the sake of this conversation sometimes. There is a memory of the interactions between the Abrahamic faiths that is different, that is talked about differently than how they're discussed in the Western world. One of the most important things that I could use to highlight this is in Islamic religion and in the story of the Hajj, the Muslims, they leave Saudi and they go into Ethiopia to get refuge under the Christian Negus of Ethiopia because they're being persecuted back home in Arabia. And they have to famously answer the questions of the Negus of Ethiopia, the king, Negus's king, and explain their theology and explain their opinion of Christ and his mother. And after they explain their reverence for the mother of the Lord, they're allowed to stay. So they're given refugee status in Ethiopia. Now, this is a huge event in the Islamic world, an incredibly like you cannot to imagine that Westerners don't understand the importance of this event is kind of mind-blowing, because without this happening, there would be no Islam. There would be no Islamic community. The Ummah, the Islamic, annihilated. So it was our relationship to the Muslims of Arabia that formed the beginning of this dynamic between the Islamic world and the Christian world. And it happened in Coptic Ethiopia. Which is why we have a similarity in prayer practice, because, as our tradition teaches, we taught them how to pray in the way that we do with the forget the word now. It starts with P. When people are on the floor.
Prayer mat.
Oh no, I can't.
Proskynesis.
Yeah. So there's this kind of relationship. So these are the things that are talked about that are not really discussed very much in the Western world. But when it comes to the distinction between Judaism and Christianity, in the context of Coptic Ethiopia, it is a very, very different conversation, because Ethiopian Copts reference the New Testament story of the conversion of the Black Hebrew by Philip the eunuch as their genesis, as the beginning of their realization of Christ as Messiah of the Israelites. So in this way, because they're celebrating what happened in the book of Acts as the fulfillment of the very long waiting period of the Hebrews in exile in Africa for the Messiah, they've received the message of the eunuch and integrated this story into the mythology of them as Israel waiting for this news. And they haven't discarded the Israelite identity in adopting Christianity. It wasn't an either or choice. For them, it was, we are Black Jews, we are Black Israel, we are Black Hebrews. They don't even use the word black. I mean, this is an American term.
Right.
For them, we are Israelites, Beta Israel, House of Israel. We are the House of Israel in exile, and now our Messiah has come, and so we're receiving it. So the expression of the faith is not referred to in this contrast between Judaism and Christianity. It is that now our Israelitish religion has been fulfilled with the Messianic gospel, with the good news of the Savior, the good news of the Master Rabbi of Israel having incarnated. And so the expression of the Christian faith in this part of the world is much more Semitic than in other areas. It's much more rooted in Hebrew and Israelite practices than you would see in many other places. And it does look very foreign for modern people to look at it from the outside, because it is so ancient.
Okay, so I mean, one of the things that David does in his book shows that, that the New Testament itself is anti-Jewish, anti-Judaic. That Paul in his letters identifies the Jews as the ones who are unable to see Christ properly, and that the Gospels, particularly John's very blunt in its naming of the Jews, so that they are the opposition to Jesus is the Jews, and presumably you all read the same texts. So how are those? How do those? Because that's one of the arguments that's made in the West. It's like, because of those texts in the New Testament, Christianity is well, I mean, David, to his credit, has always been against the kind of slippery slope to the Holocaust argument in our scholarship, so that particularly in his first book, in Communities of Violence, he tries to show in the Middle Ages that there's no necessary end point in the Holocaust in these persecution narratives. But on the other hand, it's very hard for those in the West to see it as any other way. right? It's like no matter what, from the Gospel of John to Auschwitz, straight line.
No.
Really?
So no.
How dare you?
Too much chutzpah there. I have got the word in my mind that I should use, because I think it is probably the most important way of kind of framing the Coptic experience. That hymenot, which means is how we say religion. It's translated to English as religion, but it really means the living faith, the hymenot. And if we talk about Islam, we say the Muslim hymenot. If we're talking about Judaism, we'll say like Jewish hymenot. If we're talking about Christian, we say Christian hymenot or just hymenot. And everyone is referring to their own as if it's the real one. The relationship between us and the Jewish tradition is a sectarian issue. It's not this potentially genocidal racial problem, because even in Christ's time, you see that the Hebrews in Judea were already in a lot of sectarian arguments. They had Sadducees, they had Pharisees, they had the Zealots, they had the Essenes, they had all of these. It was like this little cauldron of sects that popped up all the time. This is normal in Israelite history, to have these competing sects, different cults that are imported for, a large stretch of time. The northern kingdom of Israel basically abandoned the temple religion, and went wholeheartedly into the pagan practice, the Gentile practice of the nations around them. So there's never been a moment where there have not been competing sects in the Israelite experience, with the exception of the Exodus, when Moses gave the law to the people. But it's sectarian. So I think having this conversation about the hymenot of the different people is more about how you're interpreting the law, and how we've either received a fulfillment of it or not. That it's not Gospel of John to gas chambers, it's Gospel of John to kingdom or not. It's kingdom or no kingdom, but there is no discussion on racial distinction.
Well, the thing is, I think, in the internet world, that David's account in Anti-Judaism actually fits to a certain degree E. Michael Jones's account. It comes out in Spain in those debates around whether or not the people who converted in 1390s actually sincerely converted, and therefore, again, we're back to that problem of the Christian society and whether or not you can trust each other socially, as opposed to what you're describing. So now I'm curious, is like, hold this thought, because I want to read some more from the Almond essay, but yes. The Christian nationalist argument is going to say we can only exist as a society if we have a common religion, which I'm kind of, I'm kind of inclined to, but I think, the state creates a common religion all by itself. That would be another topic, but within the Western development of Christianity and Judaism, they're not going to sit side by side calmly waiting to figure out who's right in quite those terms. So what Almond says, and this I think it's a very nice essay that you found, because it's blunt, right? It's like it's worth emphasizing that Judaism and Christianity are more or less the same age, which modern Americans often get befuddled by because they think Judaism is the elder brothers, right? It's like, no, that's historically inaccurate.
No,
it's worth emphasizing that Judaism and Christianity are more or less the same age and share a common religious heritage, which I thought was well put, right? Both arose in the first century, he says CE, but both arose in the first century out of the Hebrew scriptures, known to Jews as the Tanakh and comprised of the teaching, Torah, the prophets, and the writings. What Christians would call the Old Testament arose out of these Hebrew texts. To them, the Christians eventually added a collection of books from the first century or so of the Common Era called the New Testament. Both Judaism and Christianity became religions based predominantly on these texts, and not on the dominant temple religion of the Jews in Jerusalem as it was at the time of Jesus. In the case of Christianity, this was because it determined its future to be not in Israel, but in the wider Greco-Roman world, which I guess is different from the Coptic understanding of Israel, right?
Yes, that's very different.
In the case of Judaism, it was because its future was determined for it in the Greco-Roman world by the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem by the Romans and the subsequent expulsion of the Jews from Israel in 70. So although Judaism and Christianity have a common ancestry, they both became religions of the books. See, I disagree with that. The religion of the book phraseology is not, I mean, Christianity is technologically the codex religion, right? The codex, but it's liturgical as well as book. And of course the Protestants pick up on the book part, but the medieval tradition has more than just books. But blah, blah. Okay, so
I think this is where the ignorance of Coptic and Orthodox history comes in, because we're not just people of the book. We don't reference it like this term is actually an Islamic term, al-Kitab, people of the book. But this fits more a Protestant approach to Christianity than it does the ancient Catholic one. So this I suppose is why I've always been emphasizing it since I came to understand it myself, that the expression of Christianity in the Greco-Roman world versus the Coptic world means that the abandoning of the temple tradition in the West did not happen in the Coptic world. The writer there has highlighted that the Christianity comes from the temple tradition. Judaism is contemporaneous with the beginning of Christianity. They're both coming from the shared foundational religious environment. That was the temple tradition. It all went back to temple religion. Israelite temple religion had the priesthood and the sacrificial system. More importantly than anything, that temple religion was entirely anchored in the experience of the Hebrews coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, and then having Moses set up the institution of the tabernacle in the wilderness. So where you have a shared foundation in temple religion, you have people that have an identity which is anchored in temple religion, and that itself is anchored in the Exodus. There is no divorcing it from the Exodus. So in the Coptic world, because of this, because the reception of Christianity happened messianically and not through Gentiles converting other Gentiles, shall I say, there's been a very strong retention of this link between Hebrew Christian, Israelite Christian, Solomonic Christian, and Exodus, and the experience of Hebrews in Egypt. And then the formation of the people of Israel in their reality as a commonwealth, and then later as kingdom, and then later in their relationship inside Israel, our civil war, because this is kind of the Old Testament documentation of sectarian issues just within Israel itself, just with the Israelites themselves, that is eliminated in Christ. Hopefully this is making sense.
Well, it's blowing my mind because I realize, yes, of course, it's like Egypt returns to Egypt.
Yeah. We go full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And nowhere else in the world can that have happened, because Moses led the people out of Egypt. I mean, it's interesting in the exegetical tradition. I said that's what I study, the hermeneutics, fancy word. The Christianity in the Greco-Roman context. The Greco-Roman context isn't as cut off from the Egyptian as later storytelling makes it sound, because the major schools of commentary were in Alexandria. People like Origen, and therefore the allegorical readings that I was studying, right, that I realize I appreciate now, like that Song of Songs commentaries that become so important in the North as expressions of the relationship between Christ and Mary, are modeled on Origen, who is in Alexandria, reading the Song of Songs as a drama of love between God and the soul, or God, Christ and the church, and therefore it is Egyptian. It's I mean, the Alexandrian Jews are the ones that are translating the Septuagint in the first place. So the Greco-Roman world has the scriptures in Greek, comes from Alexandria. It's like it's all Egyptian, but we've lost a degree of our sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, the Protestant
root,
world.
Yeah.
The Protestant world has lost the sense of it, I think, because it's eliminated the iconography that would recall it all the time. Because we've got the images in there in the stack for today. But
this one actually worked. We're now looking at Holy Prophet Solomon. Wisdom hath builded her house.
Oh, amazing.
It worked once. Sometimes our streams of pictures and conversation cross.
Yeah, the icons themselves are reminders of the Old Testament world, in a way that just reading a physical copy of the Bible.
Unfortunately, I have terrible news for you. You've become an icon. I need you to drop out and come. Oh no, you're moving again. Okay. As you were doing that description of icons, you were in fact immobile. How appropriate is that? But what I'm thinking is, of course, all of this was still in the medieval Christian tradition in the North. I mean, it's like it's like the juxtapositions here. What I could say, hey, our streams have converged now. This is showing, in fact, an image of Solomon with the Queen of Sheba, who's dark in the picture, from an altarpiece by Nicholas of Verdun, which is in the North, right? It's or I think it's an altarpiece, maybe it's a reliquary, I forget, but I remember that most of what you describe, you and I have talked about this before, most of what you described to me, it was known throughout the northern, the West, through the Middle Ages, that it's lost in the Reformation. But it was part of the tradition throughout the High Middle Ages, and that feeling of, the Old Testament is necessary to understanding the New Testament always. And the thing is, I think actually the Protestants, even in the early modern period, had much more of a strong sense of that it, like, when it breaks, it starts breaking in the 19th century with the German new criticism that I keep referring to, that I'm reading David Friedrich Strauss, but this historicizing of the text, which weirdly enough loses this whole history of the actual grounding of the stories in the places that people always remember. It's like they're grounded in Egypt, they're grounded in the fulfillment of these stories in us, right? The more you and I talk, it's like I don't know why I feel you're familiar and modern American Christianity is utterly alien, and I don't know what it is.
Well, that's probably because we haven't had Protestantism. We haven't gone through a period of that, you know, that kind of sectarian splitting, the iconoclasm. We've not had an iconoclastic crisis in the Coptic world. They did in the Eastern Orthodox churches, in you know, the Byzantine churches, but Coptics have never had an iconoclastic crisis. So we've not, I think it's probably that we've not lost our imagery, and also that especially with the reception of the Aksumite Empire receiving Christianity as early as it did, it really anchored the Coptic culture in this living remembrance of why we all ended up Orthodox Christians in the first place. Hopefully that makes sense. We would not be Coptic Christians without having the relationship to Israel that we do, both in being Israel and also Israel having fled Egypt and then returned to it at a later time. Right. So that might be why. It's a kind of ethno-geographical, what are they called? You know, when you put all the stuff in a box and bury it.
Time capsule?
I can't. Thank you. I'm not very. I'm having blocks today. It's like an ethno-geographical time capsule.
You're thinking in images, not words. That's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Thankfully, she understands me. Otherwise, I'd have no one to translate. Yeah, I think this is probably why. Yeah.
Well, as you're talking, so now I have a picture of John Robinson's something. The meeting of King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, and you circled something that she's holding.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I found that was a stage performance. That's a reenactment of the meeting of Sheba with Solomon. And the dancers are holding this staff. And it's got the two snakes winding up. It's the medicinal symbol, which I thought was really interesting, because then it re-invokes our pharmakia issue.
Well, right now it also invokes the twinning problem, right? So we've got Silent Draco, appropriately, yes. Draco, commenting, odd parallel between Protestantism, book and commentary, and Judaism and the Talmud. The liturgical and temple link degrades. Well, we will say this as Catholics, right? It's in the sacraments, it's in the liturgy. And
yes,
that has been always one of our challenges, to explain what is the liturgy to people who are more inclined to look for exposition of rules. And everything turns into exposition of rules when you end up in arguments about this in the United States. And I'm not as familiar with what goes on in Europe. Sort of get shimmers and twists of that through colleagues in different ways. But, you know, the United States, all of these Christian nationalism arguments, one, that, as I said, they seem not to be able to define neither term. They seem to be worrying about, I mean, it's like King Solomon seems like a good guy, right? He makes good judgments. Why wouldn't you want a theocratic country? that they seem to always go to, well, what laws would you have to live under? So that, you know, Christian nation to, I guess I'm talking out loud, Christian nation to people in our American conversation turns into a conversation about the law, when what I think of it as, from, you know, the medievalist perspective of commentary and storytelling and immersing yourself in the worship, is you are, you know, religion is how you worship. How you worship shapes your life and your joy and your responses to God, and maybe, you know, it shapes different possibilities of political arrangement, but it's not about the law as such, right? It's like the law may issue from convictions that you have about wanting not to sin, but it doesn't come from the law as such. And the American conversation always turns into a legal conversation, which, you know, makes sense from our perspective, because the law is all we have. We have no king, we have no church. I mean, like we're you know, Charlton Heston and his 10 Commandments, that's basically all we have.
The drive-through Exodus.
The drive-through Exodus. But what we have is law, right? And we have a very, you know, performatively very powerful sense of the sacredness of the courtroom. But I don't know that most Americans, I mean, Catholics do, but I think it's inarticulate, right? I think it's hard for them to express why they go to Mass regularly, because it happens at a not verbal level.
Yes. Well, it's temple practice,
right?
And it's faith expressed through the institution of priesthood, which is Israelitish. It's not people of the book. We pick up the Bible and suddenly we become Christian. So this is the difference between the Protestant approach and the Catholic approach, which is the apostolic approach. And because Copts recognize Saint Mark as our great apostle, the great evangelizer that converted the Egyptians, we also recognize him as a Levite. You know, he was the tribe of Levi. The priestly tribe. He came from that temple priesthood tradition as well, and so he's the one who, in our tradition, writes the liturgy, teaches Copts to worship liturgically, which is in the, you know, in the tradition of temple service. But the difference being that now we're no longer slaughtering animals, because we have messianic fulfillment of the law of Moses. And now what we're doing is celebrating that final sacrifice. You know, it's a memorial service instead of being animal slaughter. So this, again, it kind of is in the background as well, that we have received temple tradition and we have received the fulfillment of Israel, the consolation of Israel. And so this, in our psalmodies and our prayers and in our liturgy and everything, we're constantly referring to it. Who has liberated Israel? He who has liberated Israel, you know, which is us. So when we're in the liturgy, we are referring to ourselves as ourselves, not thinking Christian and Jew, but we're thinking Israel, who has been redeemed by the Messiah, and those Hebrews who have not yet received him. And that is probably the most important way that I can explain how to think liturgically about this problem is different to thinking in a formulaic way, where it's about rules and who's following the rules and who's refusing to follow the rules. Because Christian nationalism in the Coptic world is very, very different. We have apostolic succession, an apostle of of Christ coming to convert the Egyptians first, but also the Ethiopians receiving Philip the Apostle's baptized eunuch, so it's like a direct apostolic conversion process that's going on in the Coptic world that's been documented since the beginning of the Christian reality, and an entire empire in Africa formally declaring itself a Christian empire, which is Axum, which, it's quite relevant to Christian nationalism conversation because most people in the West don't even know what Axum was. They don't know anything about the Axumite Empire, even though at the time it was classed as one of the four most powerful empires in the world alongside Rome. But this was one of the first places on earth where an entire nation, or an empire, nation, empire, received Christianity and formalized it and put the cross on the coin. So the experience in the Coptic world of these kinds of conversations on, who is Hebrew, who is not, Jewish, Christian, those distinctions, and also what it means to be a Christian nation, it looks very different to what people are talking about right now in the New World West,
right.
Post-Enlightenment, previously Protestant Western countries.
Yeah, but what's interesting is the way you're describing it sounds like what Bede says happened with the Anglo-Saxons. That they get the missionaries in the 6th century, and the people convert, and so the nation, and that is Bede's whole point. It's the Church of the English, and so nation. But it's something that I'm trying. It's unfortunate when the words equivocate, right? It's like you can say things, yes, and then people can hear 3 different meanings, and they are distinct, and being able to articulate why they're distinct is always very challenging. Yes. To have a people who all worship together, who all worship Christ, is a Christian nation. But in the American political context, everybody hears it as the law, right? And indeed, and what's ironic about that is, of course, early English law under the Anglo-Saxon Christian kings was codified as a Christian law. So it's maybe understandable that they get there. So Silent Draco had an answer thinking about this. Sigh, the inner German once again. Law would be all right, tempered by traditions, but the devolution to rules is the killer. Casey says, especially when the rules are unevenly applied. Silent Draco, yep. And who applies the rules for their gain? Well, this is somehow we need to break out of this definition, because otherwise we never get, as English speakers, to the joy of the liturgy, the joy of the worship, to say what it means to say we are saved through Christ. In listening to Milo Destiny conversation, just as an example, I was feeling like, the proper answer for all Christians to saying you want everybody to be Christian is, well, yes, of course we do. Not because we want an empire and it gives us power and control over everybody, which is always what everyone imagines, right? It's like, oh, if everybody's Christian, then everybody's, under the iron thumb, which, ironically, as we said at the beginning, that Judeo-Christian in the United States is used as a political term to fight Soviet totalitarianism, right? It's saying we will not be totalitarian if we're Judeo-Christian, because Judeo-Christian means you stand against the totalitarians. And so the only way anybody can hear it now is like contaminated by that association that, oh, well, if, so again, these twin snakes problems that somehow they constantly turn into each other. So if you say Judeo-Christian to oppose totalitarianism, the only thing people can hear is it's totalitarian if you want to be Judeo-Christian. Which, of course, it fits nothing with what I'm thinking of when I say I want everyone to be Christian, because I want everyone to have the vision, I suppose, of what it means to feel. I would say to feel God's love, but that's trite. I mean, it's true, but it's trite. The the vision that I'm trying to show when I'm teaching Tolkien's vision of the being in the story and being swept up in this creation, and that we turn to Christ as our maker, the God the maker, in joy and thanksgiving. And yes, I want everybody to be doing that, because then we understand how to live together. That we've, Christ gives us sort of, I've got a new meditation on the Gospels as a fight book, rules for fighting, right? In the sense of rules for how to deal with the difficult engagements that we end up with each other in. So not fight, but that it always strikes me when you're describing the way the Copts understand the liturgy and the service and the temple service and the service, and oh yes, liturgy means service. That is much closer to what I see in the medieval Western tradition of Christianity than this, political alignment. Obviously, even though what you're describing right now, we have some pictures of people bowing before kings and Christian kings, and what does that mean? That in our modern political vocabulary, we constantly default to nothing but the state in control, and therefore, if the state is, it's a Christian totalitarianism.
Well, again, that's really the sort of a wind back to the beginning of the conversation, but the Ethiopian Coptic experience during the anti-fascist movement. I mean, we are the original anti-fascists. It was Coptic Ethiopia, which had an emperor, Christian emperor, ruling the country, that inspired the anti-fascist movement in America. It was the original Christian nation of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, that was anti-fascist to the core, and which famously, broke the yoke of the black shirts that had been sent in by Mussolini to, finish off the colonial project in Africa. So again, I've been in trouble for this, because many years ago, I tried to have this conversation with people here. And the problem is the equivocation. The language we have a poverty of language, and people are unwilling to sit down and have very long conversations the way you and I are doing now, to see what kind of language are we speaking. Because just like that word Haymanot, well, depending on which religion you're in, it means three different things to three different kinds of people. A Muslim Haymanot, a Jewish Haymanot, Christian Haymanot. Three different understandings of the same word. So I was trying to explain in my head what being a nationalist meant to me, and linking it to the experience of Ethiopia defeating the fascist power of Italy. And people lost their mind. They went mad. And I couldn't imagine why.
I mean, defeating the power that actually called themselves fascist. Right, that they had the definition and everything. Fascism. Yes, actual, true Italian defined fascism because of fasces, because of the Romans. Yeah.
Yep. But I got in trouble for it, so I thought, okay, I've hit a grenade. I have no idea what I've done. And then after a while, after several years after this has happened, realizing that there is no, how should I say it? There's no mainstream conversation happening in the conservative circles of Western culture right now, which are referencing the experience of Coptic people in Ethiopia fighting the fascist powers, and not referencing Christian empires that existed before the collapse of the old world into this massive global conflict. It was like Armageddon, fascist, anti-fascist Armageddon. But we had Christian empires. We had Russia, they were a Christian empire, and then we also had the Ethiopia Christian empire, the world's oldest Christian empire. So this is bubbling back in this is bubbling in the background. We had a Christian nation. Wow. Where did they come from? How did they end up a Christian nation? This 3,000-year-old monarchy that was so Christian that it had crosses on its flag. The imperial flag of Ethiopia is covered in crosses. But the other thing that, is important in the conversation about, what it means to be Judeo-Christian, imperial Ethiopia also had Stars of David all over its flag. And it had as its emblem, as the imperial emblem of Ethiopia, the Solomonic dynasty has the Lion of Judah holding a scepter with a cross on the end of it. So just in that flag, we have, I cannot emphasize it enough, just in that one flag, we have the perfect definition of what it means to be Judeo-Christian. This is a completely different conversation than what is happening in the West. Instead of a racial issue, it's not even a sectarian issue. It's the fulfillment of Israelite identity in Christ, in the priesthood, which practices in continuity from the ancient temple, which is in continuity from the tabernacle of Moses. And so it's in that context that I have this kind of conversation when I'm discussing Judaism, Christianity, Islam. It's Ethiopic, which is Solomonic. And I think this is why I've got in trouble with so many people, because unless you've been to this part of the world and you've spent time with people that are from this part of the world, this seems, it's a foreign language. We're speaking a foreign language. I was lucky enough to be catechized in this kind of environment and to also spend time with people from there, with other Semites from the West who had also found themselves there and were having the conversations at the same time. So avoiding the tension over suddenly there being a racial problem, we were all sitting down together as Solomonic people having a discussion over sectarian issues and what it meant to practice religion that was connected to Solomonic people. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, so now I'm showing, I think, People with a Camel and the Visit of the Magi together, which is the anchoring of these stories. What occurs to me while you're describing that is that you're rooted in the place. I mean, you're not, because you're in Australia, but so you're just as much a part of us as the rest of you. It's like the Copts are rooted in the place where the story came from, much more deeply. Whereas Americans, Vox talks about the American Indians being displaced, and that's something I'm familiar with from where I've lived in the country, starting in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Therefore, among the only peoples in the United States now who weren't displaced from their ancestral homes, the Pueblo. Everybody else got, shoved off land and moved around and lied to, and treaties broken, and and my heritage is of peoples that moved from their ancestral homes. The Jews in the West, that's their, among other things, their self-definition is they were driven out from Palestine by the Romans and then move around in different parts of the Mediterranean, and then in ways that are very unclear, I think even for the professional historians, end up on the Rhine in Germany in settlements from the early 11th century. It's like they don't have a sense of being in place, which is a longing for both of us, both for Americans and both for American Christians and American Jews. And that then, just as you're speaking, it makes sense why Israel became such a focus. It's a pilgrimage focus, obviously. It had been a pilgrimage focus for the British, the English speaking people since antiquity, since the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, they immediately start traveling to Rome and then going on to Jerusalem and having pilgrimages. There's a lot of imagination layered onto belonging in that region. And what you're describing with the Copts is they never left. And that there's comings and goings of some people from Egypt and the Exodus, but then there's the return. I mean, as I was saying, the Jews in Alexandria create the great exegetical schools, like Philo of Alexandria's allegorical readings turn into the major Christian readings because they're kind of reading the same way he did. And that you have these, I think I those next. Yes, the flight into Egypt of the Holy Family, that they go to Egypt. There's, they can, because there's communities of people that they could live with in Alexandria and other parts of Egypt. So it's this, I mean, the world, we've been talking about the displacements of people constantly with colonialism and the empire, and now free trade and free movements of people thanks to labor movements. And the horror and chaos means nobody is home. Nobody has any homes. Nobody can afford to buy them anymore because of loans and usury and and it's interesting. The flight into Egypt is one of the the displacement stories, but it's also a going home. Yes. And then because Mary is the ark for Christ, he's always home when he's with her. Yes. We're homesick.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I felt it like the first time I went into a liturgy. I was, it wasn't English speaking. I think it was in Ge'ez, which is the liturgical, like high liturgical language. It's a Ethiopian's version of Latin. It's the old language, old Semitic language. But it was a wonderful feeling because I thought, I'm home. And people will hear me say that and go, oh, okay, you're just, you're insane. Well, no, because it was sort of like, this is the temple. I'm inside now. Right. I can feel it. I'm back home. And I was with my people, which in a post-Enlightenment way of thinking makes no sense whatsoever, because everyone would say, oh, what's your passport? Oh, you're Australian. Who are these people? They're African. You're the palest person in the Southern Hemisphere, and you're surrounded by all of these people from Abyssinia, and you're saying you're home and you're with your own people. But in terms of the spiritual reality of Israel as temple kingdom, it makes sense. And I felt it when I was in that liturgy. And that is why it had such a profound impact on me, because it's real religion because it is temple tradition. And for people who are displaced, and we have been displaced many times, I suppose, especially in a globalized world, there's a rage about what has happened to everybody. Borders have been broken up and demographics are changing, and then there's this denial of even ethnic reality, because everybody's so terrified of difference, even though they're celebrating it constantly. Everyone loves diversity, but they're constantly equivocating. So it's like, what are you doing? You're homogenizing. But
yes, I've been thinking about, we said this a bit ago, with everybody celebrating diversity so much because we don't have any.
yeah, exactly. It's just that's the vending machine effect, right? It's like
Coke or Pepsi.
You serve yeah, exactly. You serve empire and you become you become a subject of empire, and then everything homogenizes because that's what empires do. But within the liturgy, I saw it. I saw the retention of identity that wasn't fictional. It was apostolic. I saw the retention of the reality of our people who have been flung into different regions that have retained apostolic practice, which is celebrating Christ's incarnation through Mary as Mother of Israel. You know, it affected me profoundly. It affected me profoundly, and I couldn't leave it. It was completely different conversation to moving to a different country because you're vibing with that culture a little better. It wasn't like this. I understood that there had been a continuity of tradition and that people in the world had retained the temple tradition, and this was what I felt I was starving for in my experience as an Australian, because we don't have it. We don't have anything like this. This is a post-Enlightenment world. The culture down here, I mean, we don't have a Middle Ages period, you know. It's a similar thing to America, but we don't have faux
Middle Ages. I went to the church in Sydney, St. Mary's. It's Gothic, appropriately, right? Yeah.
Gothic revival. Right.
So you have faux Middle Ages like we do here.
Yeah. It's like we've redone it as a nod to it, but we don't actually have the Middle Ages here. So all of the reference points that exist in Australia that point the culture back to its roots, you know, the Western expression of this Solomonic religion, they're not here except for in the liturgy. That's the only way you'll find it. Because
the liturgy is the only thing that carries this kind of rootedness anyway.
Yeah. Which is what you were saying about Christian nationalism, that this isn't rules. It's not formulaic. It's not a constitution. It's not contract law.
Right.
It's prayer. It's worship. It's building reality through the worship of God. Building, I can't even say building reality. Reality is reality, but it's understanding reality through the worship of God. So this is a very different thing than what a lot of people are talking about when they want to have Christian countries. It's a very, very different thing.
So this is you've inadvertently but happily answered one of the criticisms I also have when people try. All religions teach the same things. Like, no, they don't. They very much don't. But there is this. So there's a great. I spent a lot of time when I first came to the University of Chicago, the now not Oriental Institute, and I forgot what they renamed it. They renamed it this last week. This name hasn't stuck with me. West Asia and North Africa belong in the title, in the subtitle. That Egypt has this allure, and has for Europe all along. Napoleon tries conquering it and makes a big description of it, and that's the very interesting engravings of the monuments, which are buried in sand because, of course, during the prior to the modern archaeology, nobody's digging them out of the sand. And I have drawings of these temples in my home, one of them over my desk, right? So I'm always looking at the Temple of Philae, which to me says temple, right? It's like the Egyptians, when the Israelites leave with Moses, they leave the temples of Egypt, and that they carry with them this conviction that worship has to happen in a temple does not surprise me. But this, I'm too much in Tolkien right now too, but this feeling of going back into the deep past and being there in the reality is incredibly powerful. It's like when we get cut off from that, people wither. We want to be rooted in that story. I mean, for Tolkien, it's all very botanical. There's all trees and such, and you want to be rooted into that life. It's like we're talking about coming home. It's like when we get, I do feel this, when we're cut off from the fullness of this tradition, we die, right? It's like we're cut flowers might be able to look good for a little bit, but then just wither and collapse. And none of that has anything to do with whether or not politically we're freer right now. It's a mistaken perception of the meaning of life, or the purpose of life. And I mean, to the extent to say all religions do that, well, what kind of participation do we have in the service to God in all religions? That there are ways in the I think that like the Indian subcontinent devotions to particular avatars of the divine, to me, look similar, and then I start wondering about the continuity across the middle of Eurasia. Alexander the Great, he was there in both Egypt and North India.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously I'm a historian, and I like imagining myself back into all these stories. But somewhere in there, it feels like, yes, there is a true religion, but it's something about this reality. And to the degree to which religions teach the same thing, I feel like they've got to be participating in this reality, because otherwise they can't. It's nonsense. There's reality. That's it. You don't get multiple realities.
No, you can't have multiple realities. This is where it was useful having Solomonics to talk to. I'll just refer to them as Solomonics, because having the conversation with people about being the same race that crosses color lines was very important, and also the same race that crosses religious lines, and then having this discussion about who worships God in the proper way. It was always about right worship, right versus wrong worship, in reflection. That would be the best way to summarize it. Not so
to be fair, that was the conversation in Europe in the early modern period. It was always what's true religion, and they meant what's true worship. Religion then did not mean these sort of different boxes that you can choose from at the grocery store kind of feel. It was which manner of worship is correct. And of course the Protestants say you shouldn't have images and priests and all of that. So they were arguing, in fact, over proper worship, which is what.
So it wasn't a branding problem. It wasn't like, which brand
it's a branding problem now, but then it was I mean, they obviously got in some big arguments about it. It was if we worship wrong, and then they end up in the legalistic worry of, God will reject us and we'll all not be saved. And okay, guys, do it beautifully. How's that? Right. So oh my God, why is it so hard? But the ancient priesthood temple, it's like as far as where I go at St. John Cantius, it feels temple, right? It's the priesthood serving in the temple. We as the people assisting the priests in making the offerings to God, right? That's a worship. And then because the longer I go, I've been going there for about a year now regularly. I was going to my more local parish in Hyde Park here at first. Now I gotten allergic to Novus Ordo because it doesn't feel focused enough on God.
I have never been to a Novus Ordo Catholic service, but
the priest faces you, which is like, oh, we're going to be the community and work together. And it's like, no, the priest is facing the altar because that's where God is. So I'm totally ad orientem. I get that now. And the solemnity is witnessing to that moment of attention to the divine.
Well, this is the distinction. This is the Judaic and Christian distinction, in that during Lent we're fasting, and then the end during Holy Week that we're in now, and having the liturgies that we're having now in reflection of the crucifixion of the King of Israel. We want to invite all people to participate in this liturgical temple reality. So it's not a case of political power. And it cannot be a case of political power, because, as I've written, just recently, you can't legislate metanoia. You cannot legislate repentance. Love is not litigious. We cannot fall in love with a Messiah because someone has signed it into law. This is impossible. The only way of doing this is to come to Christ in his temple, in the expression of service to Israel's king through the priesthood that he established. That's the only way I can describe it. So that the argument, the argument now is, oh, we're a Judeo-Christian civilization or not, or the Jews are doing this and blah 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 blah. The Christians are doing this, blah 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 blah. Well, to me, it seems like the civilization itself is schizophrenic, making that distinction, because what you're arguing about is contract law instead of saying, hold on a second, what temple are we worshiping in? This is a more important part of the conversation, because I can have conversations with Judaic Semites regarding worship without falling into screaming fights over racial fractions. I can have these conversations when it's anchored in the reality of like Coptic Solomonic expression of this practice, because we're recognizing that there's a Semitic root to it, and then it's not just like, oh, it's therefore acceptable because it's Semitic. It's that we haven't denied what temple we're in at the time. So yeah, this is like I don't know if I'm doing a very good job.
Well, I think you get in trouble with American Jews too. I think.
Well, it's funny. But it's funny because
insofar as I mean, not being Jewish and therefore having to rely on it being an outsider's perspective on things, I'm not clear.
Well, I mean, if I get in trouble, that's fine.
I just say I haven't. So our problem, I mean, our present problem is simply describing our position, right? Our the next level in love is helping other people get to this position, and for American Christians, it's being calm, and I mean we're very the conversation is going on big tents and emotionalism. Casey's saying big tent is a unique Protestant American revival tradition, which sought to eliminate religious differences. It's specifically Presbyterian, my people, and it was like literally tents that would bring people, particularly Scots Irish, into these enthusiastic revivals. You'd never know that from Presbyterian churches now, because they're not very enthusiastic. How do you? I think you're very anchored and real and I mean, your liturgical focus I love, right? For American Christians, there's so much anxiety about even being able to say things that robustly. Well, some American Christians, I think some are actually comfortable with it. But the ones that create problems with talking about Judeo-Christianity and then getting anxious politically, not so much.
Well, I mean, maybe this is just because I have a lot of Judaic friends, or like how should I put this? I had these experiences while still spending time with American Jewish friends of mine. Even now, when we talk to each other in letters, we'll say next year in Jerusalem. There's a deep longing in my heart to have people who have been displaced by empire and who are scattered by imperial machinery and dispossessed of rooted identity to find it, which is why I don't like colonialism. It's like not all colonialism. That's a different story. But because I see the mechanisms and what the empire, what many of the empires have done, especially the one that we're all experiencing currently. The dispossession is intense, and the displacement is intense, and everyone can feel it, and everybody is the emotions are heightened because people are they're suffering lack of roots, and everybody wants them. So when I speak to other people that are so, how shall I put it, honest about being scattered within empire, which I think is something that I really do appreciate about Jews very much, Judaics, is this: next year in Jerusalem, while we're in exile, we're diaspora, we're scattered. They're remembering possession of geography. And there's a kind of reflection then on the relationship between being rooted and being, pushed around by imperial powers. But because Copts never lost the geography, that tension doesn't really exist, because they're not displaced, they haven't lost their roots, and they're manifesting fully the expression of Hebrew religion. So I don't know, like, if I get in trouble with people, that's fine. I say this.
It's not so much you get in trouble, it's just, I think so one of the things Peter Novick said in his book on the Holocaust is part of the reason it was so intense for Jews, particularly in the 70s. There was a television program that everybody saw. I remember seeing it growing up, Holocaust. It came out the year after Jesus of Nazareth, right? In Roots. We were really, the miniseries was a great event in American religious life. One of the things that made it possible for the Holocaust to become the central feature of Jewish identity in the United States was that many American Jews weren't practicing anything else that they recognized that would identify them as religiously Jewish. So, the famous secular Jew, but they'll identify through their suffering in their families. So it's confusing, I think, and this is maybe it's like we're talking about how Christians in the Coptic tradition do not have some of the same, frankly, hang-ups as Protestants and Catholics do in the West. It's like they're, depending on where the traditions developed in the different regions of the world, the religions don't carry the same character. And that's true for Judaism as well as Christianity.
Very much so.
And yet what you're describing is the longing across all of these traditions maps, literally.
Yes.
It makes total sense to me that it happened in Jerusalem, right? It just feels the center of the world. Right? That's where it is on the medieval map of Mundi. It's there right in the center, and it does. There's something about that place in the world that part of our geographical reality.
Mm. Yeah, it's the bridge between all worlds.
Yes.
European, African, Asiatic. Yeah,
it's a powerful place.
It is. I mean, this this may be shocking to a lot of Americans, that the events of World War II, the Holocaust, they did not influence Jewish identity in the African diaspora the way that they influence the identity of the European or the New World European diaspora. Right. And it's even it's even caused a few problems within the Jewish population. In Israel, there's been an effort to integrate more of the African Beta Israel expression into the larger Jewish, kind of religious expression, because they had different festivals. They had something called Seged, which is a festival that commemorates the receiving of the law, the Decalogue on the tablets by Moses on the mountain. So it's like this massive holiday. We're back to Charlton Heston.
We made it through the drive through Charlton Heston.
Yeah. But that community, they have this, it's a, yearly celebration to remember we received the law through Moses. So it was very much like based in the reception of the commandments on Sinai, and the experience of, okay, what was happening when we just received the law? We've just been pulled out of Egypt with this, psychedelic plague experience, and the magnitude of what happened during the Exodus. But this Seged is, it's really important to the Beta Israel, that are practicing kind of Judaism which they call Haymanot. So again, if you use the word and you're equivocating, you lose the subtlety. In Israel, Haymanot, you say that, they'll know, you're talking about the Beta Israel Judaism. And they had a completely, unique expression of Judaism, because they were disconnected from Europe for, forever. They disconnected from European experience, disconnected from the Judeo-Christian tension of Europe. They had their own experience. But there's a much stronger feeling of wanting to remember the Exodus and the reception of the law and being tabernacle people than I think in a lot of from what I can see in a lot of the conversations now about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be a Jew. Very few people talk about the Exodus in being the ethnogenesis of the Israelites, really.
Black Americans do.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
There's even songs that most people know that center the Exodus. Yes.
Go down, Moses. Yeah. So I find that interesting, and that has great resonance with us as Copts. Yeah. Great resonance. There's like Black American songs. The storytelling sounds Coptic to me.
We should after you've celebrated the death and resurrection, we should do something more joyous, like spirituals. And the liturgy. Then I had to figure out my stream. Well, actually, we can't stream. We don't. I could put anything in classes. That tomorrow in Tolkien we're going to do music, and I can play what I like, right? It's like I'm not sure what I can play into YouTube and have them worry about copyright or not. We'll have to sing ourselves. We'll have to sing it ourselves.
Yeah. Well, we're in our Passover right now. You know, for our Easter, we are now back in Egypt. We're slaughtering our Passover lamb, and we're hearing the cries of the Egyptians. We're hearing the cries of the Egyptians right now in the Coptic world. So right now we're in Exodus. Yeah. Is that a bad place to leave it?
No, I think it's a good place to leave it. I can't figure out how to exit quietly. everybody leave silently. Let's see. Okay, so we have Casey and Silent Draco have been carrying on. Big tent problem, very superficial, based in emotionalism, much like politics today. Yes, I hope after this conversation we've touched we touched every live wire there is. Oh my god. Every third rail we could think of so far.
Yeah. That's what we do, isn't it?
For someone, it's for an arc, we seem to keep banging into rail lines a lot. How do we do that? I thought we were on the scene. Silent Draco saying much of it was based on the big man, big speaker, very personality based. Yes, I think there are clues in this about new layers of trouble that we can get into. So I have a meditation about getting in trouble, and it's like the why, Rachel, do you keep getting in trouble? Because you'd think I'd learn how to avoid it after a while, right? With the years of following, being in Milo's entourage. Professor, I think I'm an entourage of one with him. As Christians, we are going to be the stumbling block to the world, inevitably. And if you are not being scandalous, you are clearly not enough of a stumbling block to the wise of the world. I have also been thinking about the other Egyptian part of the Christian culture that becomes very much central to the medieval West, which is monasticism, and the way that the desert fathers of Egypt go out into the desert to get stronger fighting the demons, because that's where the demons are. And the longer you're there and the stronger you get, the bigger the demons get. And so I hate to tell you this, but don't believe in ghost stories. Well, here we are. Yet again, the pirates land, sailing straight into the storm because, well, that's what we need to do. And there was a third reason that I was trying to figure out. It's like, why do I keep ending up in, you want me on your side, frankly. Those of you in academia who may be watching, because I will stand up for you when others won't. And I've proven that, I hope, a number of times. And that's what we do as Christians. So if those of you wish to be Christians in the nation, think that it means that you'll be comfy in a band, think again. You will be the one having to stand for truth and Christ when everybody else wants you to shoot the elephant. And if you don't get that reference, well, we'll have to explain that one next time.
Yes.
George Orwell, Shooting the Elephant. Recognize who we are, who you are, if you are pressing for the death of the noble creature and are too afraid to not do it because of all the people standing behind you wanting the show. Yeah, okay, that's gnomic enough.
Scandalous.
I think, yes. So we have Patrick Coffin always has his catchphrase, be a saint, what else is there? We have failed to have a catchphrase.
Well, We'll have to work
We'll
on
have to
it.
work on it. I think scandal has to come into it because,
Definitely.
yeah, be scandalous. Christ was, is. No, wait.
Mm.
We don't have a phrase yet. We'll have to work on this. You guys will join us next week as we figure out our catchphrase, right? Happy second Easter. Aren't you happy that we get two, just like hobbits? Thank you for joining us.
Happy Easter.